Hi everyone, this is Hannah Quinn. For this week 7 presentation, I've chosen the topic of psychoanalysis. To start off with, I hope you enjoyed this little Magritte reference. We will begin with the discussion of Sigmund Freud. Freud was a Viennese doctor who originally developed psychoanalysis as a therapy technique for his patients who were suffering from issues like neurosis, but found that it was a method that could be more widely applied. In his method, Freud states, our mental life is different from our conscious life. In other words, there is a distinct difference between our conscious everyday lives and that of our unconscious selves. One key way through which the unconscious is expressed is dreaming, which can be studied through various means to discover latent thoughts and feelings. Another key principle of psychoanalysis is that sexual impulses are central to human behavior and are present from infancy. One way this can manifest is through an Oedipus complex, or when a young boy develops a rivalry with his father for the role as the object of his mother's erotic attention. He wishes to replace the father. The boy comes to understand that he would be punished if he were to act on this, and thus represses the desire. Another way this can manifest is through castration anxiety. This develops when a son is upset when he finds out his mother doesn't have a penis and fears he will suffer the same fate. Even though he later learns this to not be true, the initial fear still remains. According to Freud, this can be linked to fetishism and homosexuality later in life. Sublimation and symbolism. Freud's ideas of the unconscious and conscious are based on a model of conflict. For example, his idea of civilization is based on the repression of desires to maintain social order. Since he proposes the same mental structure exists throughout history, this offers an answer to the hermeneutic problem that we've discussed throughout this class. He considers art as a form of sublimation. In other words, a way to express in an acceptable way our sexual desires that have been repressed. Freud compares the artist to the neurotic, each failing to repress fully the contents of their unconscious. The job of the psychoanalytic art historian is to examine the surface content of the artwork to identify the latent desires and wishes that hides in its symbolism. Freud applies his method of psychoanalysis in his study of Leonardo da Vinci. His primary concerns are with how Leonardo's infancy influenced his adult life as well as his sexuality. Freud bases much of his argument on a story that Leonardo credits as being his earliest memory, of a vulture swooping down and sticking its tail in his mouth. Freud suggests that memories are not permanent, but instead are fluid and are being constantly influenced by our unconscious. Using this story and his theory of castration anxiety, he explains that Leonardo had an overly sexual attachment for his mother, which led to his homosexual tendencies. Later on, Leonardo moved in with his father and his new wife, essentially gaining a new mother. Freud posits that this new fantasy of two mothers manifests itself in the painting Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and Saint John the Baptist, in which the two women almost appear to share a single body. Laura Mulvey and Alan Jones. Laura Mulvey's work is a great example of the way that Freudian principles can be used to analyze the viewing public as well as the artist. She does this in her discussion of Alan Jones in Fears, Fantasies, and the Male Unconscious, or You Don't Know What's Happening, Do You, Mr. Jones? She notices that while women are displayed as sexual objects in Jones's work, their genitals are never seen, and the women themselves are also posed using many phallic symbols. She describes this as evidence of a fight of the fear of castration, and as a result, fetishism. In a strictly Freudian definition, fetishism occurs when a young boy suffering through castration anxiety cannot rectify in his mind his mother's lack of a penis, and instead finds a way to perpetuate the idea of the maternal penis. Instead of suggesting that this is a personal fantasy, Mulvey contends that this is widespread in imagery that can be seen in all forms of media. In the words of Hatton Clonk, Mulvey is looking for a social unconscious, a general set of psychic attitudes and fantasies which underpin social life and attitudes. The eye and the gaze. In his work, Freud is obsessed with the idea of looking. This is described most concisely in his notion of scopophilia, or the pleasure in looking. As Hatton Clonk explained, looking, he argues, is fundamental to the child's psychosexual development. The desire to see is always underwritten by sexual curiosity. The theorist Jacques Lacan was indebted to these Freudian ideas of looking, but elaborated on them in a slightly different way. One of Lacan's basic principles was that of the mirror stage. He states that when a child is young, it understands itself as a whole being, but when it sees itself in the mirror for the first time, it realizes that this is a false sense of unity and that there is a difference between the conscious and the unconscious. Thus the creation of the ego as a defense mechanism in the never-ending quest to regain the sense of wholeness that was shattered. In his next theory, the eye and the gaze, the eye is the rational side of looking, whereas the gaze is the unsettling sense that the world looks back at us. This creates the notion that there is always something outside of our control. Unlike in Freudian theory, where art offered a level of comfort to the viewer in its attempt to bridge the gap between the conscious and unconscious, Lacan states that we will never be able to pacify the gaze. Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors is a great example of this. At first glance, the viewer seems to be able to grasp a sense of the picture plane, but this sense of ease is subverted with the inclusion of the distorted skull at the bottom of the picture. Furthermore, as the viewer backs away from the image, the painting looks back, continuing to throw off the viewer. Lacan and feminism. In his theory, Lacan focused on the way that cultural representations and language shape sexuality instead of the Freudian theory where sexuality is the foundation of representation. This idea was popular amongst feminists because it allowed them to focus on the influence that sexism had instead of the sex of the artist. Laura Mulvey once again talks about women, this time in Lacanian terms. As Hatton Clonk put it, the reproduction of patriarchal thinking is at an unconscious level. No matter how much a woman may consciously resist sexism, the gaze, that unconscious vision, seeks to reaffirm sexist ideas socially inculcated and internalized. In order to apply the psychoanalytical method, I will now discuss a new piece, Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare. I chose this piece because it is the painting that comes to mind anytime someone mentions Freud to me. As the title suggests, this painting depicts a nightmare scene, already tying into the Freudian importance of dreams where the unconscious runs free. Here we see a woman stretched out asleep in an overtly sexual pose. What is assumed to be an incubus sits atop her, possibly representing the male libido. Lastly, a crazed-looking horse penetrates a curtain in the background, which could easily be read as a euphemism for sexual penetration. Upon conducting some brief research, I found that Fuseli was a very sexually charged man. He had an obsession with a woman named Anna Landolt, and in a very suggestive letter to a friend, he describes his dream of having sex with her, even going so far as stating, "She is mine and I am hers, and have her I will." When she rejected his marriage proposal and married another, he possibly let slip his conscious and unconscious desire to have her. A possible understanding of this painting could be that he was projecting his feelings of abandonment onto the dark imagery of the painting already discussed. Additional evidence of Fuseli's life and his relationship to women, especially his mother, if the information is available, as well as his childhood, would be even more helpful in creating a more biographically driven analysis, since much of Freud's theories revolve around the mother figure and infancy. It would also be beneficial to have more information about who would be viewing such a work and the kind of reception it got to approach it from the perspective of the viewer. Another more abstract example of the way that the unconscious has influenced art can be seen in Hal Foster's article, The Primitive Unconscious of Modern Art, in which he discussed Pablo Picasso's La Demoiselle d'Avignon. In this, he describes the way in which the MoMA, or the Museum of Modern Art, refused to acknowledge the influence of African tribal masks on works such as Picasso's, and instead chalked it up to the primitive unconscious, because if the other that they tried so hard to keep separate was accepted as a source of inspiration, the wall they built would begin to come down. As Foster himself put it, the primitivist incorporation of the other is another form of conquest. Lastly, it's time for the conclusion. I hope that you take away these 3 main points from this week. Number 1, by searching for latent meaning, the psychoanalytic art historian aims to uncover the unconscious meaning of a work. This is often tied to infantile sexual desires. Number 2, for Freud, art was a means of resolving the break between the conscious and the unconscious. Lacan, on the other hand, believed that while art sought to pacify us, it will always fail. Number 3, psychoanalysis provides a way to look at art from the artist's perspective, at the work itself through symbolism, and at the viewer. I found this week that the main limitation of psychoanalytic analysis is that it's really only discussed from the male perspective. Everything that I read, especially in terms of Freud, seemed to phrase everything from a male-driven perspective. Be it the Oedipus complex or castration anxiety, women were just a foil for male fears and worries. Not only that, but we've since proven that much of this is just flat out isn't true. The main strength that I want to take away from psychoanalytic study, though, is that it gets us to look at things not only from the artist's perspective, but from the viewers as well. This is so important, but often overlooked. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed my presentation over psychoanalysis this week, and have a great week.